Our sponsor today is GLSA. For those non-members who may be dropping in on the call today, GLSA, or Group Legal Services Association, it's an affiliate of the American Bar Association, a professional membership organization representing the legal services plan industry and provider attorneys. And joining GLSA is just a good way for solos and small firms to increase their business. Check it out at glsaonline.org. Okay, my name is Tom Martin. I'll be your host today. Our teleconference is Agile and Lean Approach, the Agile and Lean Approach to the Practice of Law with John Grant. And I'm very excited to introduce him today. Our guest, John Grant, or John E. Grant, because like me, it's a common name, so John E. Grant, is an expert in helping lawyers harness change for the better. John is a graduate of Tufts University and Lewis and Clark Law School. He's worked for an assortment of great companies, Microsoft, Meltzer Grant Consulting, as an adjunct instructor with Portland State University. He's also the chair of the Oregon State Bar Innovation Committee. He's currently the founder of Agile Professionals and the co-founder of Start Here HQ. And he is an expert in legal process improvement and technology consulting. So John, it's a pleasure and honor to have you on the show. How are you doing today?
I'm great, and thank you for having me. And I want to make like two quick corrections just right out of the chute. And one of them is that you said we're going to talk about the lean and agile approach, and I'm always pretty careful to say that I like to present an agile approach or a lean approach. And for me, right, and not to get right, maybe diving right into the details. For me, it's more about mindset than it is about dogma. And I think understanding, that agile and lean and design thinking and lean startup, all of which are things that I love to talk about that maybe a lot of lawyers haven't heard of or don't know that much about. But they all bring really good and useful tools to the toolbox of problem solving, right? Which is what lawyers are best at. And so, I try to be really careful about saying, look, I have some tools. I've maybe studied some tools differently, both by virtue of, and I apologize, I have a new puppy. And my wife is painting. I'm working in my home office. My wife is painting upstairs. So I have to keep the puppy occupied for a little while. So hopefully he won't yap too much.
No worries.
But by virtue of having worked in the business world and specifically in the software industry, they have a very different approach to problem solving than lawyers learn in law school, and it's been interesting for me over my life and my career to be able to compare and contrast and sort of build a toolbox or a library of different tools and methodologies that can work well in different situations. And then, of course, the trick is figuring out what tool is going to work best in the situation that you're in.
Right. And I completely understand. And thank you for the clarification, because I know that, sometimes we tend to think in categories and box things in, but I think the important thing about our conversation today is to keep an open mind. And that's exactly what you're providing, is, a new insight as to how to do this. But before we get into the details, how's it like in Portland? That's where you're located, right?
Oh, it's gorgeous. We are having what is likely to be our last summer day of the year in Portland. It's supposed to be about 85 and sunny, and then the rain will come, and it won't come permanently, but it will start coming a whole lot more often for the next few months. So we're enjoying it. It's gorgeous here.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that. It sounds a lot like Vancouver, where I'm calling out of.
Right.
Yep, we got to hold on to those sunny days while we have them.
Yeah, you bet. You're very familiar with the particular ebb and flow of activity with the seasons, and when we've got such sort of rainy extremes.
Yep. So again, thank you for making time for us this morning. I've heard such great things about you, and I'd like to get into the details, but first I want to learn a little bit more about you.
Okay.
Like, where did you grow up in Portland?
I didn't. So I grew up in the town of Bakersfield, California, right, which is an interesting part of the state because it's not, it is very Californian, but it's very agricultural and sort of industrial. There's a lot of a pretty robust minerals industry. So, I was exposed to some things. Although it's also true that I come, particularly on my mom's side, I come from a family of lawyers, and so I've kind of grown up. My great great grandfather was actually an ABA president. Um,
Wow.
he was, in terms of true sort of pioneers and innovators, he was one of the first people to understand that in the 1920s and 30s that the entertainment industry needed a different type of lawyer than maybe previously existed, and Hollywood specifically. So he made a career for himself on the backs of really fun clients like Shirley Temple and Charlie Chaplin and Walt Disney and Howard Hughes. So it's there's some really exciting stuff in that family history, and he was very successful and very innovative in the way that he um, looked at this sort of new body of clients and people that he was interested in, and problems that he was interested in helping solve, and really built a practice um, around those specific needs, right? And it was a combination of a lot of contracts and intellectual property licensing and specific deals around specific ventures. But then also it was a little bit of maybe how to get a quickie divorce in Nevada back in the
Right.
day, and and some other things. So although it's uh, I'm fourth generation. There's a lot of sort of lore and experience, and then obviously because he was so successful, he inspired a lot of his progeny and future generations to pursue a career in the law as well. Um, which of course meant that when I went to college, I wanted nothing to do with being a lawyer. I had no intention of going to law school, and in fact, I did work, as I said before, in the software industry for about 10 years before I eventually really kind of got attracted by the education more than anything, and the tool set and the learning and the ways of thinking, and all the things that law school is really good at and good for. um Eventually I wanted to see what that was about for myself.
All right. Well, it sounds to me like innovation is probably a bit in the blood, a family tradition there.
It is definitely in the blood. Yeah, no, I can count innumerable aunts and uncles, and my grandfather and great uncle were attorneys, and back at a time when maybe not a lot of women were, but now in the my parents' generation, many aunts and uncles both, and even in my generation, there's a pretty good handful of us that have pursued careers in the law.
So when you were a kid, you didn't necessarily see yourself as being a lawyer? It was like what did you want to be?
That's a good question. I don't know that I ever had like the strong view of, I want to be an astronaut or a fireman or any of the sort of traditional kid things. I've always been, I think, fairly intellectually curious. I tend to do, even through my sort of academic scholastic career, I tended to do very well in those classes that either had subject matters who were interesting to me, or teachers who were engaged with the subject matter in a way that was interesting to me. In college, I had a slightly better than 3.0 average, but it was made up of a combination of A's and C's because I was really good at getting A's in the classes that I engaged with, and those that left me behind, I kind of didn't pursue quite as much. So I've followed a lot of different paths. Even as a kid, I was always interested in doing the things that were interesting to me at the time, and I
Who-
continue to do that.
So who was your great great grandfather? The one that was uh,
His name was Lloyd Wright, Lloyd Earl Wright, which he obviously frequently gets confused
right.
with the architect. And yeah,
So
he was an ABA
he
president. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, he had to use the E too, right?
He had to use the E, yeah, and I actually have I have a cousin who is Lloyd the Fourth, and now I guess a first cousin once removed who is Lloyd the Fifth. So they're continuing that, um, down my uncle's generation.
All right. Well, I guess one thing maybe to address is like you don't for people calling in today to listen to you about
Hmm.
talk about these new approaches and for myself. I mean, for you this is family tradition, but you don't have to have that, right? It doesn't you to get into these ways of thinking about process that we're going to talk about. You don't have to have that in the blood, right?
No, not at all. And I mean, one of the things that I think about, and I didn't actually know my great grandfather. He passed away when I was very young, but from what I know of him and talking with other members of my family, he wouldn't recognize modern legal practice, right? He was part of a big firm in Los Angeles, or he ran a big firm in Los Angeles, which meant that they had like 8 attorneys, and that
Mm.
was big. And as many sort of support staff as not, and obviously there were things like the act of typing correspondence was a much more complicated thing to do back then, with carbon paper and all the rest. But um, still, I think it was a very different time. It was a very different profession and industry where there was a lot of one-to-one engagement. And and maybe one of the other differences that's changed over time, which again is maybe part of the benefit of just having had this family history. But talking with my great uncle or my aunts and uncles, and parents, cousins, and all the rest, right? For a large part of their practice, it was very normal, in society, for people to have a person who they thought of as their lawyer, right? And that's my lawyer, in the same vein as that's my doctor or my dentist or any other profession. And I think for the most part, that's a notion that doesn't truly exist in for the majority of society anymore, right? That's become a luxury item for only um, the uppermost reaches of society. And it's interesting how the practice has evolved, to sort of support those people more, maybe more so. And it's part of what excites me so much about group legal and the great work and important work that's going on. Um, I think at that level of practice and the types of innovations that are possible is that it allows people to have an everyday connection with lawyers again, which is something that I think we're really have been lacking in society.
Yeah, I think that's a real interesting point about the change in the air right now in the legal industry is that it is towards reestablishing that relationship. And
Definitely.
so in terms of the innovation that's in the air and this approach um, that you're um, making lawyers aware of.
Yeah.
And we I used the term lean and agile before, but if you can tell me a little bit about what it is that you do.
Yeah. So, at their core, I would say they are, lean and agile both are problem solving methodologies, right? And as lawyers, we are taught a couple of sets of problem solving methodologies, right? IRAC is a problem solving sort of framework, at least. Um, the Socratic method is a teaching methodology, at least. And I think the specific set of tools that we use in learning the law and how to apply the law, things like adherence to precedent and stare decisis, right? Those are problem-solving methodologies. You analyze a problem and then you look to the past and you see how those sorts of problems have been solved before.
Mm.
Or if you don't know exactly how that problem's been solved before, then you try to make an argument for the next best analog or closest thing to it. Um, and that's a very useful problem solving methodology when your goal is stability and the stability of society. But when your goal is to sort of be innovative, right? To innovate either in terms of business model or perhaps product development or gaining market shares, looking to the past doesn't give you any sort of an advantage in that area. And so, starting to get a little bit into the specifics, and I'll try not to go too deep because it's there's lots of places you can look to sort of study up. But lean specifically comes from lean manufacturing, which ultimately comes from Toyota. There are elements of it that go back even further. But the basic story, as I understand it, and the genesis of what Toyota considers to be the Toyota production system, but the rest of the world calls lean, um, is that in post-war Japan, in the 40s and 50s, industry was basically decimated, right? I mean, the whole country was in very tough shape. And so whereas in the United States, we had, say, automotive manufacturing that was very much built on the Henry Ford assembly line, as reinforced by the nearly limitless demand for manufacturing that the war brought on, we were very good at producing the same thing over and over and over again. Um, Toyota didn't have that luxury because there wasn't demand for any one of the same things. And so Toyota had to be able to build sort of different types of products for different customers in a way that was still efficient enough that they could compete in the marketplace. And and again, my understanding of it, the thing that's, I guess, most interesting to me about lean is that they ultimately came to understand that efficiency itself is sort of a terrible goal. And the way that I sometimes describe it is that imagine the world again, back in my great grandfather's days or even before, right? A world before the electric drill, right? And craftspeople had to make holes in things in order to build furniture or houses or other things using a manual drill. And someone who was skilled in how to build furniture and how to do the things that they're doing, when the electric drill came along, they were able to be far more efficient at that particular piece of the process, right? So you
Right.
put that tool in the hand of someone who knows what they're doing, and you can build more good things more frequently. But if you put an electric drill in the hands of a novice or someone who doesn't know what they're doing, all they do is put more holes in more things more quickly.
Right.
And so, what Toyota came to understand is that the actual what most of us think of efficiency, right? If we set out to simply improve a small piece of the process, we actually could wind up doing more harm than good. And so, the Toyota, the ultimate definition of efficiency from Toyota's standpoint had to do more with quality than it did with speed. And so what Toyota and other, many lean manufacturers since then have come to learn is that and I'll frame this in terms of the problem, right? So one of the problems with General Motors and Chrysler and Ford and all the American car makers back in the post-war era is that they were really good at rolling things off the assembly line. But if there was something wrong with one of their processes, right? If a particular wiring harness didn't line up right, or a nut got cross threaded or whatever, by virtue of the assembly line, that flaw would also get perpetuated in every machine that they built and every car that rolled off the line. And um, the original the original response was, well, we'll just have a fleet of mechanics at the end of the assembly line, and we'll fix these things as they come off, because we can't stop the assembly line. That would be too inefficient.
Right.
And then eventually they stopped doing even that, or at least didn't do it as much, which gave rise to the lemon laws of the 60s and 70s. But that's another story. Toyota said no, like, what we think there's a different way. So in a Toyota production system, every worker on the assembly line or on the shop floor or wherever is actually empowered to stop the entire process when they encounter a defect. So if somebody notices, hey, this, again, this wiring machine or this paint station or this bolt threader is producing a problem in a Toyota production system, they're encouraged to stop the line. And instead of, as you might imagine in a traditional manufacturing plant, like instead of management freaking out about, oh my gosh, we're losing all this efficiency, in a Toyota production system, that's celebrated because they, oh, there we get to now eliminate a flaw, and we will bring our best people to the floor, right at that moment, to try to solve this problem and fix that defect now so that it never gets perpetuated through the machine again. And what they learned over time is that by doing that and by making small improvements to their process, right? And in some cases, it was in reference to an actual defect. In After they sort of got really good at eliminating defects, it became more in the context of finding opportunity. Oh, again, maybe this particular bolt assembly, or wiring assembly, it doesn't have a problem anymore, but we could be doing it more quickly. And so let's actually spend some time and effort and investment in understanding enough about the system so that, again, over time, number one, by eliminating defects, and then number two, by very slowly but intentionally improving things along the way, they got far more efficient than their American counterparts at the time.
I would think it would also give rise to the workers having a greater sense of ownership in what they're doing, and being a part of the process, so that when they contribute that, it's taken note of by management, and so there's not as much of a disconnect. um, and by taking that ownership, they are much more productive, and you have a better product in the end too.
Absolutely, yeah, and it's there's a little bit of a yin and yang in there, I think, and I'm probably misusing that metaphor, but you have to empower your workers. You have to give them a sense of empowerment, in order to have the confidence and safety that, oh, by pulling what they call the andon cord. And for those of you who are into podcasts and radio shows, there's a great This American Life episode about the NUMMI plant, NUMMI, in California, which was a joint venture between, I think it's Toyota and General Motors, and how it was sort of General Motors' first foray. They basically invited Toyota into this joint venture to fix their most problematic plant. And the story of This American Life does a great job of the storytelling.
Mhm.
And it's just very interesting to hear all of the problems that existed and how the Toyota management was able to use their principles behind, again, what they think of as a Toyota production system, um, to not overnight, right? And that's part of it, right? In effect, the term that they use at Toyota is Kaizen. And as best as I understand it, the translation for Kaizen is continuous incremental improvement.
Mhm.
Um, and I sometimes talk about it, in working with lawyers and other business people. Um, it's a little bit like the difference between um, betting on the entire stock market, investing in an index fund, and investing on individual stocks. Right? You might have a great big bang return if you can spot the next big thing and make an investment in your process improvement, right? Bring it back to the law firm context. You might say, okay, great, I'm going to go buy this piece of software, or I'm going to invest in this new employee or anything else. And by doing that, I think I'm going to get 15, 20, 30% more efficiency.
Mhm.
But that's a bet, right? And there's risk associated with that. And sort of by putting all your chips in that particular basket, um, it may pay off, but you also run the risk that it won't pay off and that you will lose that investment. Whereas, the index fund approach, or even, investing in a CD or a savings account, it's a little bit more like compounding interest. So if you can get yourself in the mindset that uh, I'm going to improve a little thing this month, and then I'm going to measure and I'm going to see if that improvement paid off. Um, and if it did, then I'm going to learn from that, and I'm going to try to make a similar improvement in this other area next month, and then another one the month after that. And if you can get a 1% improvement consistently month over month and over the course of a year, those improvements compound like interest. And so you may have that 15, to 20% overall improvement, but the investments you've made along the way are much smaller, more calculated, and maybe more likely to succeed because they're set over a smaller time horizon, and we're much better at trying to predict the future in short-term increments than long-term increments.
Okay, so I think I have a better handle on what this lean approach is and how it's been used, in manufacturing and with Toyota. But what are do you have like a concrete example of how maybe you've used this with a client, or just even just a story of how this gets applied within for a lawyer or within a law firm where this kind of approach um, is implemented, that it could actually lead to some improvements in the practice of law.
Yeah. Well, so before I do that, let me talk a little bit about Agile because I think, at least
Yeah.
in my career, I've come to understand that, um, and there is a lot of stuff out in the world that is around lean for lawyers. But one of the things that I've experienced, because lean comes from the manufacturing industry, and not to take anything away from those that are doing lean in other environments, there's something almost inherently visual about the way that it works. So parts of lean have to do with inventory, and you can see bottlenecks that exist in your manufacturing workflow by virtue of the inventory that starts to pile up at the bottleneck. And one of the problems with knowledge work generally is that we don't actually see our work very much, right? It mostly exists either sort of between our ears or on our devices. And so we don't get that same visual sense. And so Agile, without again going too deep into the history, which I probably did with Lean, um, the Agile is a relatively new methodology. It comes out of the software industry. There's an official Agile manifesto, the birth of which happened in 2001, so we can sort of date it.
Mhm.
There are Agile things that were happening before that. Obviously, it didn't just come fully formed out of anybody's head. Um, but really, that Agile manifesto, and you can visit it at agilemanifesto.org, by the way. And I won't go into the specific pieces of it, but um, the pieces of the Agile manifesto, or the Agile approach in general, first and foremost was about taking some of the learnings from Lean around smaller horizons. And software at the time, again, this is through the 80s and 90s, had very much a long form planning methodology where you didn't have a new instance of Windows every year, right? Or Microsoft
Mm.
Word or QuickBooks or whatever, right? It might have taken 2 or 3 years for a new version of a big piece of software to come out. And so the process around developing that software was very cumbersome, and it involved this sort of very heavy planning lift in the early stages and figuring out what sorts of features that customers wanted or thought they wanted, and then negotiating with your developers and everybody else to say, okay, well, how long is it going to take, and what sorts of resources do you need, and at the end of it would be this very large long form project plan, which at the time was just called project management. And we now think of that type of a project plan as a waterfall approach because of the Gantt charts that are used to monitor them. Like when they all go well, the Gantt chart kind of looks like a nice easy waterfall graph that gently flows towards your desired goal. But you
Mm.
know, in reality, when you're doing that sort of long form planning really becomes a form of guessing. And there's several things that happen along the way that cause problems and cause deadlines to shift or scope to creep, or assumptions that were made about what a customer wanted in 1995 were actually far different from what the customer actually wanted in 1998. And so Agile originally was a way to um, really take all those and get to a more iterative approach for releasing software. And so again, the metaphor, the thing that I point out for people is that if you look at for those of us who are old enough to remember the old Windows releases or QuickBooks releases, or these long form things where you had to like get this new thing and you would wait years and years and years, maybe even for bug fixes. Compared with today, when the apps on your mobile device, many of them update every week, right? So Facebook or Spotify or Google, right? They're constantly releasing little bits of code into their software product. And that's just reflective of the Agile approach, right? So it's very much a continuous delivery, continuous improvement paradigm, which gets its basis from Lean. But the other thing, and part of what I wanted to get into Agile before I answered your last question, and I can stop. Did you have a specific question about that?
No, I was just going to say that it sounds like the older approaches were more like a big ship trying to make course corrections, and then you weren't even sure about how to change the direction in which your big ship is moving, and it's hard to do. And these
Yeah.
newer approaches make that ship a little more nimble in terms of making change over time.
So I would say that's exactly right. And the other thing that I would add to that metaphor is not only is the ship hard to turn, but also the port is moving. So
The
you know,
port is moving.
the port is moving. So the port is like, what do your customers want? What do your clients want?
Oh,
And right. So when you're trying to steer a product or a service towards delivering value for your customers, and at the end of the day, right, that is the goal of all of these methodologies, is to deliver maximum value to your customer, right? And I will use customer instead of client. Um, Although for legal they're often interchangeable. I can get into the nuance between the difference, but we won't do that now.
yeah,
Um, right. So it's all about delivering value to the customer, and then of course capturing some portion of that value back for yourself in terms of profit, right? And that's the fundamental equation for any successful business. Um, but in this day and age, in part because of what people have come to expect due to the rapid speed of technology change and adoption, and the dissemination of information and all the rest, right? It's really challenging. Like what a customer wanted last year may be substantially different from what they want this year. And so the agile approach is much better suited to, um, through these quick releases, getting to where the customer is rather than getting to where you originally planned to be, because those aren't the same thing.
right. So we're in the legal industry more still like the big ship that's hard to turn, and not the more agile or
Well,
ship that. But
yeah,
but
well, and here's why. Because let me comment on that, and then I'll let you finish. Sorry, I don't mean to overtalk
that's
and
great.
not finish. But because this problem-solving methodology that we're taught in law school is very based on tradition and precedent, and basically respecting those things that have already been decided, that's a really that's a feature when you're talking about stability in the rule of law and stability in society. But as a business approach, it's really dangerous. And the problem, or one of the problems that I have come to believe exists, is that because that's the only problem solving methodology that many lawyers ever learn, right? Especially those that sort of go straight through from K to JD, um, they um, try to apply that problem solving methodology to the wrong sets of problems. So business problems, the stare decisis and adherence to precedent is a uh, kind of a terrible way to manage a business, right? I mean, there are elements of it that can hold true for a while, um, but eventually it's going to break down, right? Eventually someone is going to innovate you out of that business if all you ever do is what you've always done.
Mhm.
And so I think getting to this more agile approach and understanding, and again, part of sort of my personal mission is bringing awareness and education and experience with these different sorts of problem solving methodologies to lawyers, but not in their capacity as lawyers, attorneys for their clients, in their capacity as business people trying to basically meet the needs of their customers. And I think the
Mhm.
problem solving tool set that you need for the latter is different than the sort of tool set that you need for the former. Although I think the other
Right.
healthy side effect, right, and many of the lawyers I've worked with and who have become more agile also get better at solving their clients' problems because they it's not like they're in that situation where they have a hammer, therefore everything's a nail. Right? They actually do have some tools for solving problems that maybe aren't even legal problems for their customers, but or their clients. But if they can be helpful, they're still adding value, and that will help their overall relationship.
So, what are some concrete steps that lawyers and law firms can take to become more like that nimble ship?
Yeah. So to finish my piece about Agile, and I think this is a good segue for it. The other thing that the Agile revolution did was sort of bring to modern practice a tool that's called the Kanban board. And some people say Kanban. It kind of depends on what part of the country you're in, but it's Kanban. Um, and again, it's a Japanese word, and Kanban, what it actually translates to is sign. And I actually find it, in sort of a noodly way. Ken Grady, who is sort of one of the founding people behind Seyfarth Shaw's Lean program, Seyfarth Lean. He's now teaching at Michigan State Law School, and he talks about like the original kanbans were actually shingles for businesses in Japan. So there's sort of he's identified this very interesting connection between hanging a kanban or using a kanban in Japan and hanging a shingle in our sort of English parlance. But in any event, right, a Kanban is a card, right? So in lean practice and in agile practice, Kanban is a card. And how it's wound up working in agile businesses in the software industry is that when you have a feature request, right, for a piece of software or a product or whatever, right, it's hard to, there is no physical representation of that feature. So in the agile world, they use mostly sticky notes, although sometimes 3x5 cards, and they will write information about that feature request on the sticky note, and then they'll put it on a wall. And then on that wall will be organized through a series of columns in the steps that are required to produce that sort of update to the software. And the wall itself and the board itself, right, a wall with columns on it, winds up representing workflow stages in a knowledge work manufacturing process, right? If I can torture the metaphor a little bit, and the cards themselves, the sticky notes or the 3x5 cards, represent the actual work orders, the work requests from clients. And once you have the work requests visible and in the context of a board that's visible, all of a sudden you're in a situation where you can see your overall process and also the work that's in that process, even though it's knowledge work, right? And the card it's a representation of the work, right? It's not the work itself, but it's sort of I compare it to a legal fiction, right? It's a fiction that works. And what winds up happening when you can take a step back and actually see your work visibly and visually, then your ability to process that work starts being able to harness all sorts of different neural pathways that we associate with vision, human pathways that we associate with vision, as opposed to sort of the text-based processing that lawyers are more comfortable with, they're more used to.
Mm-hmm.
And so getting to your question about what can lawyers do to start to harness these tools, the thing that I usually recommend is you can build a very basic Kanban board as early as today or maybe tomorrow morning to help manage your personal day-to-day workload in a way that I argue and I usually see, and again, these are I don't try to force this on anybody, right? So I'm offering tools that maybe people aren't aware of, but I think that the Kanban board is far superior to the to-do list or the checklist as far as keeping track of your tasks on a day-to-day basis. And so,
Is there like a piece of software or something where you could try it out?
um, yeah. So the answer is yes, and the number of pieces of software is growing probably by the day. And um, while I like some of them better than others, and I'll name a few of them in a minute, the thing that I would encourage everybody to do is build a board on your actual wall with sticky notes or 3x5 cards or something before you go try to build it into software. And there are several reasons for that. So, number one, it's faster and cheaper. Even though there is free software out there that will do this, um, it still is. There's no learning curve. Everyone knows how to use a pen and a sticky note. And so even with the simplest free software, there still is a learning curve to get yourself up and running. Number two, if you're drawing lines on a whiteboard, and this is another one of my sort of, I was going to say pet peeves, but maybe it's more one of my missions is that I think every lawyer in the world should have at least a 3 foot by 5 foot whiteboard in their office. Personally, I think 4 feet by 6 is better. We've got plenty of things on our walls that may or may not help us do work for our clients or manage things, but the dearth of whiteboards in the legal industry relative to the rest of the business world is sort of shocking to me.
Yeah.
But even if you don't have a whiteboard, you actually don't need one. So sticky notes will stick to most walls. It kind of depends on how much orange peel you have, or whether you have textured wallpaper. You might need some Scotch tape to help them stick. But you can very easily draw either some lines, or you don't even need physical lines, but blue painter's tape is great and relatively inexpensive. You can create a very simple Kanban board in less than 5 minutes. And
just to be clear, Kanban, it's spelled Kanban, right?
Yes, that's right. And so, in building the board, so let me describe a basic board, right? And I'll talk a little bit about the difference between a board and a to-do list. So a typical to-do list is binary, right? It is a list of all the things that you need to do. And then when you've actually finished one of those things, you can either check the box or scratch it off your list and it becomes done. But what a to-do list doesn't capture is those things that you've started to work on but haven't yet finished. And where a Kanban board is different is that it actually has 3 states of working rather than just 2. So it's not the binary, either it's done or undone. You actually have 3 columns. So the column on the far left of your most basic Kanban board is to do. The next column in the middle is doing. So these are the things that are actually in flight. And then your final column on the board is done. And this is just the most basic board. There are lots and lots of ways of building it out from there. But for getting started, that's enough. And so what I often recommend to lawyers is start just with, what are the things that you need to do today or this afternoon? And draw 2 lines on the board, which gives you 3 columns, or you don't even know if you can imagine the lines. You don't even necessarily need the tape there. But for each thing that you need to do today, write it on a sticky note. I like to encourage people to use verbs when they do that, and put it in that to-do column. And then as you go through your day and you're actually working on things, you move your to-do items into doing. And then here's one of the tricks, and part of what helps it work so well is you try really hard to only have one thing in your doing column at once. And the reason behind that, right, and at risk of going on a further tangent, there's a lot of brain science, and you may have seen, multitasking as being largely debunked as a successful methodology for productivity. monotasking or unitasking is sort of the new vogue, and there's a lot of brain science behind it. So basically, what brain science, and I won't get all the right accreditation correct, although there's a some Daniel Pink and other I'm sure Shankar Vedantam, some other people have done some writing about it. Um, but the brain science is clear that we don't actually, unless it is doing a very simple task that is almost autonomous, right? So we can walk and chew gum, we can walk and talk, but we can't actually carry more than one complex thing in our head at a time. And so what's actually happening is your brain is engaging in sort of a rapid switching back and forth between the two. And that switching between the two actually takes up more sort of energy and attention and time than just working on a single thing does. And in fact, the Daniel Kahneman book, Thinking Fast and Slow, is one of the ones, and he won a Nobel Prize for his research in this area. And one of the studies that Kahneman did, as I understand it, is just having a grad student go for a walk around campus with an undergrad and have a regular conversation as they're walking, and then at some point the graduate student would spring a complex problem on his companion, and almost inevitably when they had to sort of think about that complex problem, the undergraduate student would stop walking, so they wouldn't even really walk and think at the same time.
Interesting.
So that's a tangent, but in any event, getting back to the agile approach and the Kanban approach, I really try to encourage people to force themselves into this paradigm that once you bring something into the doing column, you're making a commitment, to yourself, but also to your customer for that item, that I'm going to work that thing until it is done. And if you sort of tell yourself, I'm not allowed to bring another thing out of to do into doing until I free up space, until I give myself the capacity to actually do that work, um, then this sort of very interesting thing happens. And one of the, if you read up on the Kanban methodology, one of the sort of uh, original thinkers behind the Kanban method uses the phrase "start less to finish more." And what winds up happening is that by unitasking or monotasking, you will finish that one thing much more quickly than you would have had you tried to juggle it as part of many different tasks. And then the same is true for the next thing, and the same is true for the next thing. And what people find is that if they can hold themselves to that monotasking, which is, it's an impossible ideal, right? I mean, we have too many things competing for our time and attention to ever truly achieve it, most of the time. But if we work towards that ideal, what we'll find is that we're better at delivering things more quickly, and meeting our commitments more often. And ultimately, we'll be more productive through our day. So
Well,
that's the basic structure.
I think that is, I think that's a great tool. I'm actually excited to try that out. And but in interest of just the time that we have left, I want to,
Yeah.
we've talked a little. You've talked a little about lean, and what it means, and agile and what it means, and a little bit about the complexities of being a big ship and having difficulty doing course corrections, and how we become a more nimble one. And so one tool that all of us can use to learn more about that and how to process things and be better in terms of the quantity and quality of tasks we do is this Kanban board. Um,
Yes.
I guess, do you have, um, is there one, I guess, piece of advice that you would want to leave the lawyers with today about something to think about for their practice using this method?
Um, Boy, run some experiments. Um, the thing that I bump up against a lot, um, with lawyers is like I want to try this, but I don't know where to start, or I'm not sure how this will fit, or it, if I do this one thing, it becomes a slippery slope, and then eventually I'm going to have to do all these other things. And there's some validity in that, but at some point you sort of have to turn off that issue spotting thing that we learn in law school, and sort of just try something. And when I say try something, I don't mean try things willy-nilly. So one of the other things that really comes out of the agile methodology, but also some others like lean startup and design thinking, um, is that when you run these experiments, when you try something, you should support your experiment with data, right? I mean, and that's the core of the scientific method. But you have a hypothesis, right? So I think that um, by trying a Kanban board, I will be more productive on a day-to-day basis, or I'll have fewer things fall through the cracks, or um, I'll just feel better about not losing track of my to-do items, which is another benefit that people talk about. But give yourself something that you can measure to find out. So, set a goal and say, okay, by using Kanban for a week, um, I think I can um, increase my revenue slightly, or I can handle more matters, or I can process more phone calls, or I can maybe not work on Saturday for a change, whatever it might be. But set a goal, a specific goal, right? I'm big on SMART goals, and SMART's an acronym for it was specific, measurable, uh, attainable. As there's different. Sorry, there are different ways of describing the acronym, but specific, measurable, attainable, measurable, and time bound is the rough SMART goal.
Right.
But just try some experiments, measure the outcomes, see what you learn from it, and then based on that new learning, run the next most obvious experiment. And if you get in that habit of trying little things on a frequent basis, then you get into that compound interest realm of process improvement, um, rather than the big bang thing, right?
Mhm.
Don't think that, oh, there's some magic piece of software that if I buy a subscription for 30 or 50 or $100 a month, um, it's going to make my life so much better. It might. I mean, I'm not saying don't do it, but like run even that experiment, run within the context of articulate a hypothesis. What do you think is going to improve? And then measure your progress against that hypothesis and see what you learn. Because that
Well,
learning is actually the more important piece.
I think that's some really fantastic advice that we as lawyers we should experiment and measure the results to make sure that we're going in the right direction. So, John, I just want to say thank you. I love getting to know you better, learning more about the lean and agile approaches and how they can be applied to the practice of law, why they're important, how to implement them in our daily practice. Um, I like to ask guests one question that's kind of off the beaten path before we wrap up, and
Sure.
that's, what's a place on your bucket list that you've never visited before, but that you'd like to, and why?
Boy. Um, it's funny. I'm a father to two young boys. Their birthdays are coming up, so they're almost 8 and almost 11. And frankly, my bucket list is very much entwined with theirs right now. And I coach both of their soccer teams, and they would love nothing more than to watch one of the A League soccer games in Europe at some point. So I'd have to say, right now, for where I am with my life and the time I spend with my boys, I would love to be able to take them to a Premier League game or a Bundesliga game, or go do something that is showing those players at the pinnacle of their professions. Right. We go to as many Portland Timbers games as we can, and those are great and fun, and uh, we are Rose City till I die all the way. But going and seeing the actual sort of genuine the cream of the crop, I think would be a great thing to go do.
Well, that sounds fantastic. I just want to thank you again for sharing your time and thoughts today. How can people keep in touch with you?
Yeah, so I go by the name the Agile Attorney, and if you Google Agile Attorney, you should find me. It's also both the .com and the .net will get to me. I actually have, and I will fully acknowledge the irony in it. I have a half-finished book on Lean Pub called Kanban for Lawyers that will walk you through the steps of creating a basic Kanban board, and it will walk you through the steps of starting to expand that Kanban board, and then it just ends. And I apologize for that, and I have every intention of getting back to it, but various things of life have happened, and I've sort of let that project languish for a while. But I do plan on getting back to it soon. Um, so that would be another way to get in touch with me. I tweet. I'm at JEGrant3 on Twitter. I'm hoping to be able to make it to the GLSA event in New Orleans this spring. I think we're still figuring out the details around that, but I know Ramon's on the call. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but we will hopefully we'll get that worked out shortly. Um, yeah, so those are the best ways. I do want to say just one thing about GLSA, and I think you mentioned that I chair the Futures Task Force of the Oregon Bar, and um, the point of that, or the purpose of that task force, is very much built around access to justice and access to legal services. And a lot of my personal passion comes from figuring out ways to scale the good work that we do to be able to help more people in a way that makes good business sense for us as well. And I think the work that lawyers who are doing group legal type work are really on the front lines of that. So I love talking about this stuff. If you go to the Agile Attorney website, there's ways to get in touch with me. I would love to just have a conversation with anyone about their practice. What are the struggles you're having? And eventually, yes, I do some paid coaching and consulting around it, but the first call is definitely free. And I just love learning and talking to people that are on the ground solving the legal problems of real people day in and day out. So please call me.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you for that invitation to our membership. I'm sure they appreciate it, and I want to thank you again for being my guest today. And for everyone who's called in, thank you all for attending our teleconference, The Agile and Lean Approach to the Practice of Law with John E. Grant. Again, this is Tom Martin. I want to again thank GLSA for sponsoring. Remember, joining GLSA is just a good way for solos and small firms to increase their business, and you can check us out at glsaonline.org. Thanks again, John.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. This was fun.
All right. We'll see you next month, everyone. Bye.